Welcome everybody to the museum this evening, and I just want to say thank you to the museum for hosting this event, and again, congratulations on this screening. So, I think we should just begin maybe with some background. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about why you made these films about Podkamien and who your family is and how that's all connected.
So my family, oh, my mic.
Is it on your chair?
Sorry. Oh, okay, is this better? I was gonna use my outdoor voice. So my family is from this small town of Podkamien, Poland. Now it's in the Ukraine. And it was a town of around 2,000 people, 1,000 of which were Jewish. And after the war, 60 to 70 people survived. So both of my grandparents were from this town. Some of the people you saw in the films are very much blood related, and some, as my cousin Sally says, are related by love. Because with so few people left from this town, they all really became family, and actually a few of them are here tonight, which is really nice. And so, in delving into my family's history, my grandparents, they had passed away 20 and 22 years ago. So in going into this project, I wanted to get a sense of what they went through, knowing that I wouldn't necessarily uncover all the details of their lives, but by listening to these stories of my relatives to really get a trajectory of what happened to the people from this town of Podkamien, Poland.
So you just mentioned that your grandparents had passed away in the 90s, and we're from this same generation, right? They call it the third generation, and this is sort of how this was built tonight, right? Is this conversation between two grandchildren. But when I look at you, and we've talked about our ages, the difference between us is that I'm 8 years older, and it seems like this maybe trivial fact, but I think about my own grandfather, and when he died, I was 18 years old. And there was a significant moment for me at that age, because that was sort of when all the survivors came to the house, sat around the table, and started to share stories about the Shiva, or at the Shiva, about his past. And had I not been able to sit at that table and hear the stories in English for the first time, I probably would have missed my, to write this book that I had completed. And I'm thinking, you would have been, when I was 18, only 10 years old. And that's a huge remove, because if I was 10 at the time, I would not have been sitting at that table, or they would have reverted to speaking in Yiddish. So I'm wondering, even though we're from this same generation, given that you're 8 years younger, given that by the time you started to make these films, the number of survivors had certainly dwindled, especially since your project comprised a few half dozen survivors and their families. And given this fact that we heard from a few survivors who said that they didn't even want to tell their stories or remember their stories, as Mark said, he just said to forget it. Given all these elements, I just wanted to see what I'm looking at as maybe like a disadvantage. How did you come to this? What did you see as an advantage that you had being a younger 3G, and what sort of strategies did you use to get to some of these stories?
It's a great question. I would definitely say there did feel like there was this disadvantage. Though, as I've said, I wish my grandparents were here, but to be honest, if my grandfather was here, he'd be 110, and I feel like, how'd you get here? You're in great shape. So for me, growing up, I had always accepted that fact. I knew my grandparents were survivors. We always grew up with stories that were very emblematic of that, but we didn't really know more. And so kind of going into the project, I did feel a little bit that maybe I would discover these stories that I had never known about. I didn't uncover so many new things, but I feel like the advantage was really harnessing, there were still so many survivors that were left from this town. And I think there's a sense of urgency, especially in this third generation, that, I think we saw even in the films in the Sarid family, even, Yitzhak and his wife Yocheved didn't want to speak about it to their kids, the second generation, for so long. And, they've had this beautiful experience, but it took years and years to get there. And I think that was a big part of, some of these films, it took a while to get people on board and ready to do it. But I think with this third generation, even though with my age and things like that, there was a sense of urgency that the time is now.
One note that I'm supposed to make to you guys earlier, if you do have questions and you have those cards in front of you, you could write them down and someone from the museum staff will collect them. Okay, so back to the conversation. So one of the stories that we didn't see this evening is a story called Isadora, and it struck me in a very personal way. And basically, when I was listening to my own grandmother's stories, she had this one tale about the time her town was being liquidated and all the Jews in the town were being sent to Treblinka to be murdered. And she had escaped with her mother, and at one point they hid in this haystack. And she would always tell me that, she spent a long time in this haystack, and I figured she was just, exaggerating the time, and I was using my own made-up logic to sort of reduce that amount of time in my head. And then in watching your film a few months ago, this film Isadora, it turns out that this man hid in a haystack for 15 months. So personally, it made me realize how foolish I had been to doubt my grandmother's story. And I'm wondering if, you were much closer to all these subjects than I was to Isadora, but I was wondering if you had heard stories growing up about your grandparents or your family that maybe you couldn't really wrap your head around, but then, some fact was presented, some detail was presented by some survivor that you had interviewed that allowed you to stop and comprehend what that story that seems so unbelievable was.
Sure. There was one story growing up that really had an impact on me, which was, like you said, your grandfather passed away in 99, and actually my grandmother passed away in 99 as well. And so I was 10 years old, and a few months after that, it was revealed after both of my grandparents were gone that my grandfather actually had a first family, a wife and a child, who were killed when the Germans threw a grenade into the bunker. And that was something that I don't remember a time not knowing that story. It was revealed very shortly thereafter my grandmother passed away. I think I had heard about it pretty shortly thereafter. And I always grew up with it, and it still seemed this crazy thing. Like, my mother and uncle grew up their entire lives not knowing this story. And I think getting the chance to sit down and interview my relatives and their friends really affirmed that. They didn't have any, life-changing details on it, but the fact that they could confirm that this happened, and to never have heard it from my grandparents, but to hear it from the people who were living it with them, I think really validated some of those stories for me.
So I think whenever we hear about or learn about this animated Holocaust genre, the book Mouse comes to mind. And when that book came out, there was a lot of praise and then also this criticism around it that it maybe diminished the impact of what the survivors had gone through. And in Mark, you use animation that was probably the most striking to me. And it was interesting sitting next to a few people in this crowd, because when Mark and his sister attacked the Ukrainian, I heard some gasps, and I heard some people wince. And that was a very powerful reaction. But at the same time, this is presented as a cartoon. So I guess what I'm wondering is, though it's beautiful and a very powerful moment in the film, were there any concerns that you had when choosing to animate these scenes, or were there things that you were cautious of in the process?
Sure. There were definitely a lot of conversations, between myself, Richard, and his company Ace and Son, who directed this animation and produced it. And there were definitely a lot of back and forths of, what we felt was right. I think the advantage of animation is telling stories that could otherwise only be told through words. The stock footage used in these films is used in more of an artistic way. They're from Poland, nearby towns, but there is no stock footage of Podkamien, as it were, back then. So there were definitely conversations and what that meant. I think in the Mark story, it was necessary to visualize that to really kind of bring home the point of what that meant, because it is one of those other stories of like, yeah, that's unbelievable, like that he and his sister were up against it and killed this Ukrainian. And I think there are a couple of other examples in the animation that really reiterate that, where there were questions of taking something metaphorical and making it literal, and what does that mean, and is that still respectful to what's being told? One of them is in the Sarid film. There's the scene after Yitzhak's entire family is murdered, and he writes in his book, Ani misachek shachmat im hamavet. And in the translation, I translated it, I am playing a game with death, but shachmat is chess. So he was really saying, I'm playing a game of chess with death, which I thought is a little weird to the American ear. But in animating it, I decided, let's have this be a game of chess with people as players. And it was definitely a moment that I thought, okay, that's kind of out there, but I think it really kind of reiterated that point of like, those were the stakes. These were this was your family and your life. And in one night, it was game over for him.
So what do you think were the most difficult stories to tell in this film in general?
I think definitely those moments that were, some of the most, painful, especially in terms of death. And I think you see that differentiation in, a scene like where Mark and his sister had killed this Ukrainian, compared to the delicate animation of when, the entire Sarid family is murdered, and it's these just silhouettes that kind of fade away. I think also one of the challenges was, here there are 5 stories, and they all kind of start out the same and they end the same in certain ways, and how to really bring new energy and new life into each story, that even if the survivors are telling some of the same details, to really bring a new way to tell them each time, because they are different when they're coming from a different survivor.
So in thinking about, I guess, how the murder of the Ukrainian man was presented, you had also, on your website, you had to do this interview with the animator, Richard O'Connor. And in that film, that short film where you're interviewing him, he says that there, is a difference in how the Jews, the death of a Jew and the death of a perpetrator would be displayed. And in the animation, he said that, to quote, it had to be treated with a degree of sensitivity, but both have different visual needs. And with the death of a Jew, he uses the words, it had to be elegant and more poetic, whereas an antagonist, rightly, needs to be, quote, shown in a different kind of light. So I'm curious, what were some of the, I guess, behind-the-scenes moments and the conversations and the decisions that really went into selecting how one was going to be portrayed versus how the other side was going to be portrayed, and maybe instead of the Mark example, a different one.
Sure. I think that one, there's like a very certain degree of sensitivity that went into. I think, and that's why it becomes kind of a representation. But I think like throughout all the stories, knowing that it's animated, knowing that these are characters, I think we spent a lot of time in discussion even what the characters look like. Did they look to, as you kind of use the words, cartoonish, and what they looked like, and the way in which they showed emotion, I think what played a big part in that, and I think you can see that, throughout all the film's examples. I guess, that quote specifically, which Richard was discussing, was the difference between the Sarid film, when the whole family is murdered, and showing that elegantly, instead of showing it as just someone saying it on screen, because I think it does make a big difference, and I think that is what the animation brings to these stories, that instead of just, seeing someone say it, you can actually transport a viewer into feeling what that feels like.
So from the, I'd asked you what was the most difficult part in making these films, but as far as the animation, what do you think was the most difficult part in deciding, how to animate a particular scene? Was there one that stands out to you as?
I think it was more, for me, about choosing the right scenes. There are a lot of reasons why you don't make a fully animated film,
Right.
Which are kind of here nor there. But I think it was, it really came down to choosing which scenes, made the most sense and really brought that to life. I'm not sure if there was like a particular one that I would say was most, it's kind of hard to remember back, which one was most challenging, but I think it was really picking those certain moments that, intercut properly between the interviews, between the stock footage, that really made these, stories, shine and really come to life.
So one of the reasons, and I'm mentioning Mouse again, one of the reasons that book was, I think, so iconic for some people in the second generation, the children of survivors, was because it offered them a way to sort of better understand their parents and also to understand their own traumas, because it was really the first time that someone from the second generation looked at these issues but did it through animation. And I'm curious to know what effect do you want your films to have on this third generation and also future generations?
I think back, you mentioned, comparatively, for us, you'd be an older 3G, I'd be a younger 3G, and actually in my family, I'm the older 3G. I have some cousins who are half my age, and in creating this, I thought a lot about them and what would appeal to them, because, I was fortunate to know my grandparents even for those 10 short years, but my cousins have never met my grandparents and what that means. And so I hope this gives the opportunity for, everyone who's alive now, but for these next generations to come, of what these stories meant, because they're not going to be as fortunate to meet a survivor. And I think if we want to, keep the Holocaust alive and keep the memory alive, we have to adapt and find different ways to tell these stories, which I think, the resources that we have are great, but we have to keep, finding new ways. I know for me, growing up, you get to a point where sometimes you almost feel desensitized because you see so much. And it's hard to see stock footage and things like that, over and over again, and for it to have the same impact. So I think for me, my goal is, finding a new way to connect to, one, the generations that are still here, and to bring that into those new generations, and find something that is palpable, without losing the impact.
So if you had the opportunity to to have had the time with your grandparents and to have been able to sit down with them to do these interviews, what do you think the core of that film would have looked like? And what do you think the central stories would have been that they would have shared with you if you had that opportunity?
I guess I think the more and more that I've worked on this project and delved into these stories is I realized that my grandparents were two survivors who were part of that group who did believe in that silence. When I think about the survivors I interviewed, 4 out of 5 really didn't speak much about it until this project came about. I think I started to realize that those were my grandparents too. I definitely see that, obviously through my time with them, but I see that take shape even in my mother and uncle, who have an idea of what they went through, but it kind of only cracks the surface. And I think that story about my grandfather and his first wife and his child, it really hit home in acknowledging that they were quite silent, as much as there was this air and a shroud of the Holocaust surrounding their childhood and even my childhood. So it's hard for me to even imagine what that would have looked like, because I think it became more clear than ever that my grandparents were actually quite silent about their experiences.
So a lot of the books and films that have been created by grandchildren of survivors, mine included, sort of features the grandchild as like this central character searching for answers. And you certainly removed yourself from that equation, and I'm sure you have good reasons, and I'm curious, why did you take that approach, and why did you tell this from sort of like that third person?
Sure. A part of me has thought if I could turn back time, I would insert myself in this project. But I think starting out, I didn't even know the impact of what it meant to be the third generation. I didn't realize what some of these stories really meant to me at the time. There are people in the story, you mentioned Isadora, whose film we didn't show tonight. I never met him before, and I probably wouldn't have met him if I didn't do this project. He lives in California. He was over 90 years old. It was the first time I met him. I was lucky enough to spend a few times with him afterwards, and now he's passed away quite a few years ago already. I forgot your question already. Kind of went off on.
So I just was curious as to like why you.
Oh, I removed myself. Yeah. So I think for me, I kind of went into it looking to tell the stories of others, and I didn't even realize what role I played in it at the time. And I don't think that became clear until after the project and kind of what it was about. And I'm thankful for that. I see now the impact of what it means, to be a part of the third generation, and the importance of telling these stories, especially, the urgency of them. And so I would say it was simply just at the time, it wasn't a consideration.
And which of these films, I know we didn't see them all, but which character or individual do you think was most reluctant to share that story, and how did you go about getting them comfortable with discussing what they seem to be comfortable keeping to themselves?
Sure. I think you could definitely understand from what you saw tonight, Mark. I think ending on the words "forget it," to me that was even a question of did I want to do that, but I think it's so important and part of the conversation. So I would say he for sure was one of the most reluctant to doing an interview at first. I think it took quite a few tries over the course of maybe a year until we were able to sit down. But part of what I think is important is understanding that kind of reticence and reluctance to speak about the Holocaust, and that in turn opens up a conversation. So, speaking with a survivor and acknowledging, okay, this is something that you don't want to talk about, and how can we make this work, and like what's off limits. So I would definitely say, he was one of a few people that, he ended up being the first interview that I did in the end, and it worked out, but it took some time. But I think really understanding silence, respecting silence, and listening through it, can go a long way.
All right. So I think maybe we'll take some of the audience questions. Okay, thanks. All right. All right, so we'll just start with the first one because it's a long one.
It's a long question.
So no censorship for this one. So there are people whose parents never told them they were Jewish. So they only found out as adults that they were second generation. We know that post-traumatic syndrome can be passed through DNA. How do you think being raised by children or the second generation, how do you think being raised by the second generation affected how you grew up?
I think it definitely created a sense of the Holocaust was always there. I never had a doubt in my mind that I was the grandchild of survivors, even if I didn't have all the details or all the stories behind it. I think growing up, even hearing, finish your food, your grandparents were survivors, things like that. I think I have the benefit of, one, knowing it. My grandparents gave me a lot of food, but also just, those kind of sentiments were always a big part of the energy and the atmosphere in my household.
So someone who is writing a book about the third generation had once asked me how my grandparents' experiences had traumatized me, and I wasn't really sure if they had, and she went on to ask, how did you feel about your grandparents as far as passing some information on to you? And I'd always been proud of them. So I guess did the stories at all have an impact on you in any sort of traumatic way? How did you view your grandparents?
I think, I still watch the films, and there are some things that still make me cry, that still really kind of, get straight to my heart. I think something that, personally really affected me was, when I did discover these things about my grandparents, and the fact that my grandparents held this secret for so long in their lives hurt me, because I felt like, whatever lives they lived, there was something still, removed. There was worry, there was, fear of risk and their safety, and it hurt me to think that they lived with that and they didn't feel that they were able to share it, and, obviously respecting their decisions not to. But to me, if anything, it inspired me to live a fuller life and to keep getting better, because I do believe that's what my grandparents wanted, for my mother, for my uncle, and what they would have wanted for me and my brother, and the families will continue. So, thinking about, more about my grandparents, because I've always thought about them, but obviously in this capacity, I've thought about them a little more. It's really inspired me to just take a new hold of my life and how I want to live it.
So there's a question about the sources that you used for your research. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Beyond, first and secondhand, interviews and accounts, I have, footage and research from, the Holocaust Museum in DC and a couple of other sites. But the truth is there is not a lot out there on Podkamien. So, I do, disclaimer, these are oral histories. So a lot of it, I took the history of the people featured in this film, and, we're using that to kind of define their facts and their history. Yeah,
I mean, there was this project by the United States Holocaust Museum down in DC, and one of the things that they had assigned their researchers to do was to look into all these places of persecution, and they had estimated in the year 2000 that they would probably find about 5,000 sites of persecution. And this is like one of the premier institutions in the United States or in the world that studies the Holocaust. And then 2 years into their research, they found out that there were 42,500 sites of persecution. And they're putting out this encyclopedia now. And when I had asked for this one entry on Kharkiv, which was a town significant to my family, I could never find any information about it. And it turns out that all of the information in the encyclopedia was coming from my grandfather. Mm-hmm. And I think what you did right here with Podkamien was you pretty much created that entry, and this town really wouldn't be known to most people, and now with these films you did that. So it's not a question. It's just
well, actually, so while I was making the project, and it's something I started 7-8 years ago, I made a little blog, and I was like, I'm going to blog about each time I speak with someone, do a little video about it, and even that blog has been turned into a project website, but I still get emails from people who they just want to know, like, are we related? Like, what can you tell me about my family? Unfortunately, I don't have the answers to most, but like, knowing that this is a resource for people and something that they're saying, hey, actually Podkamien has something in my life, it's really meaningful to me.
Oh, that's great. Do we have any other questions? Any to the audience? I'll
Most of us here, I assume, as you two, have significant contact with survivors. How are we going to effectively convey all this to the next generation, or even people of this third generation who do not have the contact? And that's the other half. We have all of what's out here in the media, plus personal contact. What are we going to do with the people who lack this personal contact?
Well, I think part of it is, creating this project is step number one. This is something that I don't just think of as a resource for my generation. I really see it as something for the next generation. I think we see that a lot. If you look around the museum, they have, experiences in VR and literal holograms, actually, of survivors answering questions, and things like this maybe to second generation, third generation, still seem kind of outlandish, but when you think about it, these are the next steps that we're taking in media to make an impact for fourth generation, whatever things like that will mean. So I think even animation is just a little toe dip in, but there's, I think, so much more to come. And I think, especially for teachers, whether you're in a private school or public school, they're handed giant stacks of what World War II is, and they are given, a few days to cover it. So I think, allowing for things like short films, I didn't want to create a feature-length film. I really wanted it to be divided up because maybe you just want to watch one of them and get an understanding. I've actually had a teacher reach out to me who said, like, I want to show these in my classroom. And I think creating things that are just a little bit easier to digest will really help pass it on to the next generation.
And I think we'll just address some of the quicker questions. So somebody asked, what does it mean they had bunkers?
Bunkers were, primarily, a lot of the ones spoken about in the film are underground. So just an underground shelter that they built. And Henry's saying caves. He's saying caves. Faye? It's under.
We got a hole and then we decide what to put in there in order to sleep, because you know it is wet. So
Faye saying dig a hole, get what you need, get it underground.
we were prepared. Many bunkers were prepared ahead. People saying this is where they're going to hide and live through the period of the war, but unfortunately, we ran from bunker to bunker.
So Faye was saying, a lot of them were prepared ahead of time. You often had to run bunker to bunker. One of the stories that Faye and Josh told in the film was that there was that one instance where people were building bunkers thinking foolishly that the Germans were coming, but that was the bunker that got attacked and the one that you were saved from by hiding in the rafters.
We were mostly in bunkers that were discovered by the Germans due to the fact that we were not wanted by the troops since we were small children.
Yeah, she was just saying that they were usually not wanted because they were small children, and that's why they had to move from bunker to bunker so that they wouldn't make noise and, kind of blow the cover of the rest of the people there.
And then there's a question, if you've been to Podkamien, if you plan to go to Podkamien, what effect did it have on the story, or how, I guess, would you visit if you haven't been?
Sure. Visiting Podkamien. Yes, Faye?
I wanted to answer. Look at it, and it starts suddenly from the, you show it here.
Yes.
They went, they had an experience where exactly buses. I figure that's going to happen. When they came back to the buses, Ukraine people stood around and yelled, "We didn't know that you Jews are still alive. Get out of here or we will take care of you." And they really got scared and they never came back.
Yeah, well, the Sarids have been actually to Podkamien 3 times. They went the first 2 times with their father, and so they were able to go from place to place and, you know, see all the sites. He could kind of guide them through the monastery, that cemetery that he destroyed. And then after Yitzhak passed away, he took that entire group of grandchildren, great-grandchildren, probably around 30 people, went with him. For me, it's on the table. The Sarids are always asking if we want to go to Podkamien. It's a very primitive town still, as they described. There is 1 bathroom with working plumbing. They all went at the beginning of the day. So to go and not have really a reference point, to not have my grandmother or grandfather to kind of guide me through, I would really be seeing the story through their eyes, which is great, but it wouldn't necessarily be the same story I was looking for, which is why I haven't gone yet, because I haven't figured out, you know, what would be the most effective way to go, beyond knowing, you know, all the places that they've been and what it means to their father's story. You know, what could it really bring to add to my story?
Thanks. So we'll take one more question, and
I just wanted to thank you. As a second generation, unable to ask questions, unable to listen to stories if they were told. My mother's Faye, by the way.
Celebrity, Faye, front row.
I grew up with the stories you tell about not knowing, not asking, and to this day I'm afraid to ask. I'm afraid to bring up the subject. And to be able to watch this and to see this, it brings things to me that I would never have asked. So I thank you, Sarah.
Of course.
all right. Well, again, congratulations to Sarah for this exceptional project. And thank you all for coming out this evening.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.